Hello, welcome to another episode of Finding Peaks. I'm Jason Friesema. Joining me today is Madeline Frey, the Clinical Operations and Compliance Specialist here at Peaks, which is, I think, a pretty cool title. It's newish.
It's newish, yeah. I am doing some administrative stuff. I'm doing some therapy stuff. I'm doing all the things in between. So, yeah, just wearing a lot of different hats these days.
Yeah, so you get a long title. When you wear a lot of hats,
yes.
It requires a lot of words
Absolutely.
to describe your title. Anyway, what we're here to talk about today is we're going to talk about trauma and then the utilization of EMDR, which I know you are trained in and passionate about. But let's start with trauma. I think it seems obvious, but maybe what is trauma?
Yeah. So many different directions that I could go with this.
Yeah, pick one.
Yeah. But I think what tends to resonate with people the most is when I say that your brain comes to some conclusion and it has its mind made up about something, but your body is telling a whole different story. When your brain and your body aren't telling the same story, that's how I identify trauma. And that seems to resonate with a lot of people. Because it takes away the idea that it has to be this amount bad, or it has to be this shocking of a story in order for it to be something difficult that you've been through. But a lot of us resonate with the idea that sometimes we just can't get our bodies online with what our brain thinks. And I think that's how I would boil it down. Okay. Yeah.
What do you think a body offline is? Like, what would that mean? Like, if somebody's kind of sitting in their trauma?
Tons of different things. Honestly, like, I think that's when we see people dysregulated, just not showing up like themselves, or finding themselves doing things that maybe then they regret or look back on and say, like, that wasn't what I intended. I wasn't in a place to be, like, using my full mind and my full personality to walk through that situation. And I mean, when I think about the clients that I've worked with, that's when people have a distance from who they mean to be, whether that's how their mental health shows up, or whether that's how substance use shows up, or whatever that is. Most people are just trying to stop that feeling of dysregulation or panic, or to get distance from it, or something along those lines. But I think that's how I recognize it, at least with the people that we have here. Yeah. I mean,
I think I've probably shared this with you before, and maybe we've even talked about it on this podcast, but I did a lot of work with vets coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and I was a newly trained EMDR therapist at the time.
I actually don't think I knew that.
Oh, okay, good. Breaking news for you. But yeah, like when these guys were coming back, like how I would describe it to them would be, it's like they have a foot still in Iraq or in Afghanistan, and then a foot here. And that seemed to resonate with those guys a lot. And they would know they're in Colorado Springs driving on I-25, but if there was a box on the road, they were so used to kind of having to avoid improvised explosive devices and that they would, like, swerve around, in their pickup or something, part of them thinking that they were still kind of back in theater, if you will. And so, a lot of the focus was on how do we kind of bring the feet back together in this present moment.
Yeah.
And so the other thing that you mentioned that I thought of is that I think one of the subtle indicators of trauma too is people have difficulty in interpersonal relationships, right? Like, trauma involves doing a lot of avoidance of triggers and, maybe having nightmares and flashbacks and that sort of thing, for what we call capital T trauma. We can get to that later, but kind of a more subtle feature is just some difficulty in relationships. And I think what you described as being out of accordance with one's body and was it body and mind? Body
like when they
emotions.
Just don't agree, or they just don't line up.
Where there's that incongruency, or for me, the foot here, foot somewhere else. It makes interpersonal relationships pretty challenging, I think. And I don't think people think about that as a part of a trauma reaction as well. And families experience that too, where it's like, I just can't seem to connect with my loved one for some reason.
Yeah. Well, and then I think about the whole avoidance of triggers that you were talking about, especially if it's relational trauma or kind of more along the lines of emotional trauma. People will get pretty good at finding out how to not get hurt again. And so a lot of times that creates distance from people in relationships.
Yeah.
But then one of the things that I remember at least learning in some of the trauma courses that I took was some of the protective factors for actually getting through something traumatic or healing from something traumatic is relationships. And then spirituality also is a big part of it.
Yeah.
But both of those components, if you can figure out how to make those work for you and use what you've learned to keep yourself safe, but it usually does require a fair amount of courage to actually address the thing, because people turns out they don't like being in pain.
Yeah, at all.
For the most part.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a pretty effective tool. Like, who does want to be in pain? Tells us to get away from something. It's it's kind of its job.
Yeah.
The issue is obviously when you're safe again, but the pain is
Right.
still telling you to avoid. That's what gets tricky. And I think you mentioned something too that I want to highlight, is that people that have been through a lot of trauma, they do tend to begin to shrink their world down to stay
Sure.
safe.
Yeah.
Pushing people away, pushing activities
Yeah.
away. And lives can end up really kind of small and very contained as a part of a trauma response as well.
Yeah.
Can you talk then? I kind of use the euphemistic term capital T trauma versus little t trauma. Can you maybe talk about that a little more?
Yeah. I kind of wish I had a whiteboard.
Okay,
right
well,
here.
let's pretend.
I'm like tapping into the therapist. Everyone, look here.
Maybe in post-production, Coover can put one up for you.
You just trace my fingers.
Yeah.
Give me one of those like glow sticks and do a long exposure.
Yeah.
So if I was to draw just the capital T, right? Like you would see the shape of the capital T, and it's the shape that it is. But I could also draw the shape of a capital T with a bunch of little tiny t's.
Okay.
And those things together would create similar impact, right? Like same avoidance strategies, same feelings of dysregulation, same
Yeah.
feelings of uncertainty,
Yeah.
and then low self-esteem too. But notice that it's either that one big thing, or for some people a lot of big things, or a series of small things over time that add up to the same impact of the big thing. So that's kind of what I mean whenever people sometimes fight me on the idea of, I think that's traumatic what you've been through.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, how do you show up because of it? And they start talking about all of these things that aren't choices that they're making, that it's not something that they're doing intentionally, it's not in line with their values, but they just can't seem to get away from it. It's kind of like it just has impact no matter what you think about it. And most of us kind of let the judgment of that get in the way. But when we talk about little t traumas, sometimes those can be just like a series of, I usually think, relational things over time that kind of stack up, that give you a certain amount of expectations of what you can get, especially from close, intimate relationships. And then when I think about big T trauma, I think sometimes single incident, some of the things that you would probably more easily associate with trauma. But I also jokingly say to my clients whenever I'm working with them that I think of trauma work as the wild, wild west. Like there's no rules. Everyone's just out here kind of getting by, and you just never know what to expect. And so I think that we have ways of thinking about it without being able to say it's exactly this or it's exactly that, or because of this is going to happen. It just doesn't work that way. So those are just some of the things that I think about in order to conceptualize what I'm looking at and how to explain it to someone.
I really like that, the metaphor of the T's, actually, and I can't wait to see what Cooper does with it. But in all seriousness, like what I thought about when you were saying that is, I used to do some like personal finance coaching with people, and
Why am I learning a lot about you right
yeah,
now?
well, I'm just letting my guard down, and basically, you know, obviously there are some people that have like a big hospital bill from a big
Sure.
event that kind of disrupts their budget, or you know, maybe an outrageous student loans or something like that. But for most people, the things that break their budget are the daily trips to Starbucks, and then the McDonald's, and then you know, a little shop here, a little Amazon
I really like
there.
that analogy.
Yeah, and I've heard it called death by 1,000 cuts, right?
Yeah.
And where it's where it isn't, there's no one cut that did the damage, if you will, but it is kind of that cumulative effect of like, you can. I remember I had a guy in one of my classes that was an airline pilot, actually, and so one of our tasks was to write down everything you spend in a month, and he like came to me and he's like, I am eating my money, and he had spent well over $1,000 on eating out in a month, but didn't think about it. Like it never hit like this is disrupting my budget. And I think in a similar way, when we bring this back to trauma, it's like, okay, yeah, to your point, like, okay, we don't have the big thing, the big event that happened in that traumatic experience, but to your point, like little elements of neglect as a kid or little moments where your needs aren't being met, but that being kind of consistent over time can be that death by 1,000 cuts, if you will.
Totally. Well, and I always think about just like the human spirit and like how people are just so geared to get by no matter what the cost. So here's a story that I like to share.
Okay.
This is, are you familiar with the Donner Party?
Yeah.
Okay.
Donnie.
So there's a book.
Getting morbid all of a
It
sudden.
is, just a little bit. Hang with me. So there's a book called The Indifferent Stars Above, and basically in this book, it just tells the story from a first-person perspective of the Donner Party. So basically what happens is it's these people going west on the Oregon Trail, and they leave a little bit too late in the season, and they're heading west. Oops, sorry, hit your microphone. Sorry, Cooper. They leave just a little bit too late in the season, and they are crossing the Sierra Nevadas in covered wagons. And you've got families, you've got men, you've got women, you've got babies, and so essentially what happens is they get hit by an early season snowstorm that traps them in the Sierra Nevadas. So cue this just very famous story where they essentially have to turn to cannibalism in order to survive. And when I look at, hang with me, I promise I'm going somewhere with this.
I love how you just casually said it, but yes, that is.
It's just such a good book. I love it.
Yeah.
And basically what happened is when you look at who actually survived, who got through that, it was mostly women that survived from it. And something that I learned just from like my own experiences in the outdoors is that women have reproductive organs that sit in the center of their bodies. And so women are more likely to experience hypothermia because their bodies are really good at taking all of the blood from your extremities and bringing it into your core. But when you're in a life or death situation, it's your core temperature that keeps you alive.
Right.
Whereas men are more likely to just die from the situation or from a low core temperature because their bodies aren't as good at bringing blood into the center. And so most of the survivors were women. So I think that story is fascinating because talk about the worst condition that you could possibly be in as a person.
For sure.
Something that like is truly a life or death situation. And there's all these different things that are true about the human body that are meant just to kind of keep you moving forward. And I think about especially women. In that perspective, it's like, we could lose a finger, we could lose a limb, but at least you're alive. And I like to think about human tenacity, like the human spirit, as kind of like that. We're just geared to survive. We're geared to keep moving forward at no matter the cost. So that's kind of how I think of trauma in that way, because there's things that are going to happen to us. There's narratives that we're going to keep about ourselves, other people, or the world that are going to be like losing limbs, that are going to be pretty detrimental to how you keep moving forward. But if we're geared to survive, we're geared to survive. And so the body basically says, what do we not need in order to stay safe? Great, we can lose a finger. Like, that's fine. We're just going to keep moving forward. So there is toughness in the human spirit that just says, like, nothing can break me, but at what cost?
Right.
So it's the cost of that, because most of us aren't walking through a snowstorm. Most of us aren't in a covered wagon crossing the Sierra Nevadas. So what is that for each of us, and what have been the injuries along the way that you just had to kind of take to keep moving forward? And how do you change those narratives for yourself in order to better support like a body that's able to live and feel regulated in this world and in relationships?
Yeah, like in a way, if you can kind of access that gratitude, like, okay, I took, maybe I lost a finger or whatever in this metaphor, but like, maybe I took my hits along the way, but it's all an indication that I've survived. I made it to this point.
Like, I'm geared for survival.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Sorry if that's too dark for this podcast.
No, and I think, remind me to never go backpacking with you. It's just like, get a little hungry. So let's talk about, excuse me, one of the treatment modalities for trauma is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So with EMDR, well, Yeah, where does the EMDR come from? What's the origin story?
Just gonna give you my spiel.
Okay,
then.
spiel away. It's
Spiel
why you're
away.
here. Yeah.
Which you are as well, EMDR trained, and I
Yeah.
haven't, been able to actually see you do this or talk with you much about
Well,
this.
that'll be the last part of the show.
Gotcha. Let's talk about my personal
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah, it's bringing an image to mind.
So I'll be curious to hear like how you kind of conceptualize
Yeah.
it in a way, but basically it came from the idea that a woman was walking and thinking about difficult things, and noticed that when she would walk and move her eyes from side to side, it felt less difficult to think about. And so that kind of spurred this whole theory, this whole practice of EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, that basically says when you're incorporating bilateral stimulation, so that side to side, you have better capacity to reprocess things, or kind of, like I was talking about earlier, get your brain and your body back online, where your brain can have a thought and your body doesn't start freaking out as a result of it. Yeah, anything you would add to how it came about? That was a very rough description.
I think that's exactly right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's my understanding too, is
Yeah.
that her name was Francine Shapiro, and yeah, she just, was just going on walks and like, why do I feel better after these walks, and got more and more intentional about, okay, what is this? And she figured out that it was this bilateral stimulation, I think,
Yeah.
getting the hemispheres of the brain to talk to one another, and that seemed to help her more ably process her problems. That's my understanding too.
Yeah, and I just get stoked about EMDR because I
Yeah.
think it's so cool, and fair warning, I could ramble about this for quite some time, so I'm gonna try to make it concise.
Yeah.
So, when you're sleeping, and you've heard of REM sleep, random eye movement, so that's when you're gonna have your eyes moving to side, that's when you're going to dream in those places, or maybe have nightmares too, kind of you were talking about with the guys coming home from war,
Yeah.
right? Like that is a lot of times associated with, I hit a certain point in my sleep and I woke up from a nightmare. So the theory is that when you're sleeping, you're processing, and when your eyes are moving side to side, that's when you're doing that at a greater speed or with greater efficiency or something along those lines. And the idea is that we're replicating that, and we're saying, how can we do that in our waking hours? But you remember how I was saying that humans are just kind of geared to survive? They just have this innate capacity. So think about getting like a cut on your arm or something like that. And what is your skin designed to do? Just scab, right? Like kind of heal itself back up. But if you got dirt or you got bacteria in that cut, you would likely see something happen along the lines of it's either delayed in its healing, or it might get infected, or it might fester, or something along those lines. It's just the healing process got stunted, but the skin is naturally meant to heal itself. That's kind of how I think about our brains.
Yeah.
They are meant to heal themselves. They're meant to take the adaptive, the good information, the healthy stuff that makes you feel whole and makes you feel human. And that's meant to meet the difficult things that you've also experienced, and meant to make it easier to just kind of live with what you've been through, because of the positive things. But if the trauma exists kind of like a cut in your brain in that way, it festers, or it becomes infected, or whatever it is. And so when we access that ability to kind of bilaterally stimulate your brain, it gives it a greater chance to kind of clean out some of that bacteria, or some of that whatever it is that's keeping you stuck in that place.
Yeah.
So at least those are some of the analogies that I offer with it.
Yeah.
But then going back to the whole, it feels like the wild, wild west, because I'm like, that's how I conceptualize this. And some of it still does kind of feel magical in that way.
For sure.
It's hard to really put my finger on, like, this is exactly how this works, and here's how I know that people get better because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. But what we do know is people do get better. I have another little story. Maybe you haven't heard it. Maybe you have. I guess we'll see. So part of doing EMDR training is you also get to go through EMDR. At least that's how it was when I went through the training. And I had a thing happen to me that I worked on in EMDR, and I'm going to tell that story right now. When I was a little bitty baby counselor, I was working with people with substance use disorder, and I had a client who I was doing his intake in my office, and he was quite fidgety, couldn't sit still. But I did the intake, and then we left my office. I'm sure I went to get a cup of coffee. If you know me, that definitely happened. And when I came back to my office, this client had the chair he was sitting on was flipped upside down. And I'm like, okay, what are you doing, man? And he's like, I lost my phone. So we flipped the chair back over. I'm like, oh, I'll help you find it. And I shoved my hand down into the couch and come out, and there's a hypodermic needle hanging out of my thumb.
Oh my gosh.
Which I didn't love. It was not great news for me. It was really uncomfortable. I kindly asked the guy to leave for obvious reasons, and like it was upsetting. Like I didn't know what was on the needle. Like it was obviously didn't have a cap, and it was a used needle, so like it was an unpleasant experience to say the least. And I kind of got over it, right? Like, but what I figured out is that I would position myself on furniture so that I would never be touching like the crack of a seat cushion or even kind of the back part of a chair or couch.
Sure.
But it didn't really affect my life much. Like I knew how to sit down, and I would never, ever, ever put my hand into the cushion or anything like that. And so I just kind of filed it away and moved on with my life. And then when the EMDR class came out, they're like, okay, don't bring up your deepest, darkest, but bring up a little trauma.
Right.
And so sure enough, I bring that up and go through the EMDR, and honestly, I pictured it like on a train moving by me, which can be a strategy for it. And now, like, it has no, like, I can search for things in a couch cushion and all that, and it's just crazy because obviously I avoided all that because every couch might have a hypodermic needle in it.
Yeah.
But actually, in the real world, even there's no hypodermic needles in my house. Like that's just not going to happen. And so, going through that EMDR process, and it like the person who did that with me, like it was her first time being a facilitator of EMDR. Like it worked really quickly, 2 pretty quick sessions, and that little medium T, not quite capital, but not quite little, middle-sized T, trauma quickly cleared out.
Yeah.
It was kind of cool.
Yeah, and I don't know what resource you had in that you incorporated into that situation so that when you think back on it, you likely probably also remember something else. Like, sometimes what I tell people is I don't know what your brain is going to do. I trust your brain, and I trust human nature in that way, that they want to get better. Like, you want to be able to sit down and not feel like wary of whatever's in the cracks around the cushions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And obviously, like in the class, like we didn't travel through any kind of channels of trauma, if you will, but like, I don't know, it was a really cool and good experience, and made me an early believer in the process for sure, because I noticed the actual result of it. So, Maddie, talk through, like, okay, so we talked about bilateral stimulation or whatever, but practically, what is EMDR? What do you do? What do you do with your hands?
So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it, honestly, and most people will find something that either fits the therapist the best or fits the client the best. And basically where I'll start is something that is more on the positive end for someone. So I want them to know that if they're going to dip a toe into what's hard, that they're going to be able to get out of the pool. So if we start with the worst and the scariest, it's probably going to be really overwhelming to begin with. But we start with what we call resourcing. And so it's like, how's your breath work? Can you notice things in your body? Are you, I call it somatically connected? Like, do you have the capacity to feel a feeling and notice how it affects your body? Everyone has the capacity to do that. It's just a matter of how familiar we are with it. And so a lot of times we might have to spend some time kind of working there and saying, like, can you regulate yourself? Can you notice what it feels like physically to feel good and regulated versus dysregulated and kind of stuck in that negative pattern? There's a couple different ways that we do that. One of them is the safe place activity, where we introduce the bilateral stimulation and basically say, we're going to practice this at a much more slow, maybe kind of shorter pace, and I'm going to have you think of a positive place, and we're going to run through the senses connected with that. So things you can see, things you can touch, things you can smell. And usually when someone finds a good spot, it's like they feel calmer, or they notice the tension kind of leaves their body in a way. So we kind of play with that for a session or two and just see how effective it is, because we want to find something that's effective for the person before we have them kind of jump into the pool. Yeah, anything you would add to the resourcing process?
So talk about, oh no, not to the resourcing.
Okay.
So I was just going to ask you to talk about like bilateral stimulation. Like, what is that practically? Like, there's a variety of ways that people achieve that, but yeah.
Yeah.
How do you see
So
that?
obviously, as the name implies, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. The initial method of practicing this was a therapist or a practitioner holding up fingers and having you follow with the eyes. It's effective in that way, and it definitely works. And there's people that I know that still do that, but I think, at least for me, what I found is that my eyes would get dry, or I would start feeling tension in my eyes, and I was focusing more on that than what I was thinking about. And so I don't love that as a therapist or a client. It also feels kind of weird to put my fingers in someone's face and say, like, okay, here's my hand.
And your shoulder gets tired, like all kinds of problems. Yeah.
And then there's some people will do tapping or something along those lines that they call like a butterfly hug, where you like go here and just try to hit my microphone.
Hit the microphone, yeah.
And then there's a light bar out there that does the same eye movement, but instead of the therapist putting their hand up, the client just follows the eyes. I actually did bring my TheraTappers with me, and this is my favorite. So I'm just going to show what's all in it. So you've got this little container or box thing, and that's what you would plug these guys into. I had a client recently call these pickles.
Okay, yeah, you plug the pickles into.
And most people will ask me, do these shock me? And the answer is no. They're just
question.
like little buzzers.
Yeah.
I think people associate it with like old school like electroshock therapy, and it's nothing like that.
Yeah.
Not like that at all. So basically, I just turn it on, and you can feel them kind of.
It's like your phone vibrating, right? Like it's like a hepatic movement.
For sure. Yeah, it just feels like a very soft, gentle vibration, and I can change like the speed, I can change the intensity, I can change the pause in between them. And there might be different reasons why I might change those for the client. Sometimes it can help kind of increase that processing speed or help them kind of get over the hump of something difficult if the stimulation changes. But this is my favorite because I think it lets people just kind of be passive and receive the bilateral stimulation versus having to create it themselves or for them to focus on me and what I'm doing. It's just a flick of a switch for me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, what did you use?
Yeah, I would have people put a pillow on their lap, and then I would tap with my own fingers the backs of their hands.
Oh, yeah.
Which that was somewhat how I was trained, but then like when you're doing that, you're also bilaterally stimulating yourself because you're like tap, tap, tap,
Yes.
tap. So I'd really like focus on things and keep myself grounded, because otherwise I can just like be wandering off into my own land. So
and actually I have a story about that. When I first started doing that, on that little box there's lights that go back and forth that tell me which one's lit up and how long it's buzzing for. And I remember counting because I want to make sure that I'm giving the right dose or whatever, and making sure that the person is getting as much as they're supposed to. And I was having these vivid dreams, and I would wake up exhausted. And I remember just passively mentioning that to someone on staff one day, and she goes, "Are you watching the lights on your TheraTapper?" And I was like, "Yes, I am." And she goes, "Stop. Don't do that, because it's gonna activate something in you that's like that." Yeah,
that's exactly right. That is so funny.
That is funny.
And I do think like kind of the edges of EMDR too is like the clients always have the brake pedal, is how I would say. Like they can always interrupt it.
Totally.
It's so important for people to feel safe and like they're in control, because that often is what kind of traumatic events cause you to feel out of control. Like the little story I told about the needle in my chair, like that is way beyond my control. And like so kind of having a safe space where you're like, okay, I'll only go as far as I want to. I always have the opportunity to hit the brakes and be like, no, I'm getting too stimulated or too flooded. And I think that part matters a lot. And I think, it's sometimes as clinicians, I think it's helpful to like give little prompts. Like it'd just be best if we kept going, but if you want to stop, we can stop. But
or is there a way that you can make this more safe for yourself?
Yeah, exactly. Because there's an element of it that is kind of exposure therapy. Like people, these images come into their minds, and Like that can be stressful, but
Totally.
Giving people strategies to kind of keep walking through it, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, part of the informed consent part of this
For sure.
for me, because I'll kind of give the spiel, I'll show the person, here's the paddles, here's the pickles, right? Like,
Yeah.
notice that it's not shocking you, it's a gentle buzz. And I think when people have the informed consent, they're able to, well, part of that is then this might be really distressing, right?
Yeah.
Something that I was taught was in the EMDR training that I took was the only way through is through,
Yeah.
right? So there's no trick, you can't really bypass it in a way. And there's been times that even when I offer that, or when I say, like, I want you to know that this could be really difficult, some people will, kind of finish a session or something and say, like, I felt like pain in my stomach, or I felt like I genuinely couldn't catch my breath, or I didn't expect that to be so hard.
Yeah.
And that's not true for everyone, but I think that there is a certain amount of, like, as you're excavating and as you're kind of touching those tender spots in your emotions or in your memories, it involves a bit of that kind of pain in that way, but again, keeping it safe, making sure the person knows that it's only what they can tolerate, that everything about their situation is safe. It's emotionally distressing.
Yeah.
And that's the scale that we use, right?
Right.
Like, I'm gonna give you a scale from 0 to 10. Can you tell me how distressed you are right now? And someone's like, this is my 10. And I'm like, okay, right? Like, we're just gonna keep working until you say we're not, right?
Yeah.
And that's my job, is to make sure that I have them, that I'm able to kind of help regulate them, and to help them get over the hump, whether that's we're going to take a break, or let's stand up, or let's change how we're doing this, or who's a positive person that you can bring into this memory for you. So there's lots of different ways that we can kind of like jumpstart the reprocessing process in a way that makes it feel like they can handle being in that memory without losing a sense of who they are or where they are.
Yeah.
Right? Like that, I think that's an important piece too, just making sure that there's safety for the person.
Yeah, I think that's so huge. And so, kind of as we wrap up, the thing, like I mentioned about my little story or whatever, like it often doesn't take a ton of time.
Right.
Like it doesn't take 42 sessions or 3 years of this usually.
Right.
And all that to say, like my experience too with myself and with other people working through trauma, sometimes you kind of clear things and then down the road other things might come up, but it doesn't mean that I had to spend all that time in between going through therapy. Like just sometimes things come up. But yeah, like can you talk about how expedited it can be to kind of get somebody through something that seems pretty major?
Yeah, I think there's something about it's kind of, let me back up. I'm going to answer your question indirectly. So when you do therapy, we call it talk therapy, right? Like you're sitting there and you're having a conversation, and sometimes you find healing by accessing compassion for yourself, or making connections and making sense of something, or talking skills and strategies with your therapist. I kind of view that as like one side of therapy, and then the other side of therapy is the body part of all of it. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that your brain and your body don't agree. And so this is the realm where you're maybe not talking as much.
Right.
You're not.
That's not talk therapy.
No, you're not communicating really with your therapist other than what you're experiencing, and then it's up to them and their training to kind of help kind of guide you along the way. But you're just experiencing, you're just in your body, and you're noticing things as they come up. And so when you're actually like doing the thing itself, you'll notice that, okay, now that I've done a few sets of the bilateral stimulation, I notice that my body doesn't react as much when I talk about that thing, or I never viewed it from that perspective, or I feel a little bit more zoomed out from it, and now I notice that was just a kid, or I noticed that parent really had their own thing going on too. It actually had nothing to do with me. So it's kind of like stepping into that and experiencing it differently helps you then remember it differently. And it doesn't always like change the memory for you. I mean, like I said, wild, wild west. You never know exactly what's going to happen, but I think when you feel differently about what happened, or you view it differently, or your body has a different response, it's a whole different kind of healing than I talked about this and I made a conclusion and I think I've made peace with that thing. And that can happen in a session, right? Not always.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that I feel like I just get to scratch the surface with them in their time in our program. And there's some people that will do a few sessions and they'll come to me, you know, the next week and be like, it still feels better.
Yeah.
Like I didn't think that this thing that I'd been holding on to for so long wouldn't affect me in that way anymore. But they're like, I keep thinking about it just to see if it still works, and it does.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting.
It is so interesting.
Because it gets you out of your head and it gets you into your experience.
Yeah, and like in my little story, like it doesn't change the memory. The thing still happened to me.
Totally.
It still sucked, but it wasn't. I don't feel anything of it. Like I don't get a flood of like fear or agitation or anger at that person. Like I just like, oh yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
That was wild.
Yeah. And you're able to kind of see
it's
it as
detached
like
from that. Yeah.
truth.
Yeah.
And it's just, okay, this is just what it was.
Exactly. So I honestly don't feel anything in my body when I talk about that. So, Maddie, I just want to thank you. I think this was a lively discussion about trauma and EMDR.
And the Donner Party.
And, yeah. I'm glad we scripted that in beforehand. But anyway, thanks you all for watching, and we'll see you soon.